And we're looking at RIMISP with links of change, and then we'll be looking at the next step. So Sylvester asked the question, and he asked, how do we work with complexity? How do we ensure a coherent and consistent monitoring, evaluation, and learning system while working in a complex and dynamic environment? For example, changes of donors or funding organization, changes in organizational culture and philosophy, the kind of range of tools that you could possibly use, language barriers, and so on. I would like to open this to all the participants. Is there anyone here who may have some ideas of how we can build these kind of monitoring evaluation systems, noting the complexity and dynamic context? Does anyone have some ideas? I see some people are typing. Yeah, because we've got so few people. If you want to speak, you can let us know. We can try to give you the mic. Thank you. So Yukai says one could integrate the monitoring evaluation system as part of a strategic plan, which is 4 to 5 years. Usually that way at least organization is committed over a longer period of time. So that's a good point. What you're saying is that you should anchor your monitoring evaluation system in something that is concrete and core and central to your organization. That's a very organization-wide approach. One could certainly do that. But what about if you don't have, let's say, a core funder? You have a strategic plan, but some of your funders may change in that period. And what I like about anchoring it in a strategic plan is that you could then say to those funders, well, this is our strategy. If you're coming on board, this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is what we're planning. Can you come on board to support us in that? Instead of following the money, in fact, you're asking the money to follow you, so you're doing it your own way. Yes, I like that very much. What about using art as a way of evaluating? Are you talking about art as in drama, theater, photography, drawing? Hi, Gloria. Yes, so it is possible to do theatre. You know, you could get groups of people together, but the thing is, I think that will work less in the policy influence. It will work with community groups. It could work with youth, but I don't see that working very well with policymakers. But the thing, what I have actually had a woman who does drama and theatre in one of my training, and she was saying that it takes quite a lot to work with people to get them to the point where they're confident to be on a stage, to act in front of people. It's not a quick fix. It's not something that you can go in and use as a quick fix. But it certainly is something that one could ask. What works quite well is giving people cameras, for example. Ask them to take photographs of the environment. We use drawing for visioning. If you want to do planning, you can ask people to draw the future that they want to see. So that is a nice way you can integrate that into an outcomes harvesting methodology. You can certainly do those kinds of things. So those will help to, to cross cultural barriers and so on. Nick, Sylvester said setting up and building a unit in charge of monitoring, evaluation, and learning in the way the team is aware of the changes may occur. Certainly. So you could have a central function in the organization that's responsible for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and they can keep the eye on changes. They can make sure that indicators are aligned, that you're not promising so many different things to different funders, that if you have a core set of indicators that you can report on those to the different people who are funding you. Gloria is saying that we could map the ideas and perceptions of who, Gloria? Could you maybe just expand on that comment there? So to map the ideas and perceptions of donors. Yes, so you can keep track of what it is that they want and how to respond to the needs. But Nick, you also raised something in the forum. You said, and I think that what you raised in the forum is relevant to this, where you said you actually have to own the issues. You have to own the you have to own the agenda, and so that actually I thought was a really important point, and that is it is a process of negotiation between the organization and the funders, and I know that it doesn't always work like that, of course, but most, I think, organizations are now moving towards understanding this complexity, and the more we talk about it, the more we share it, the more we advocate for it. I think people are becoming more open to ideas of adapting for change, but the key is that you've got to have the evidence to support it. You can't say, oh, we changed this for X, Y, and Z reasons, because it may seem that you were just being expedient, that you changed your program for expedient purposes or because you just felt like it. So adaptive management, or changing according to your monitoring evaluation system to adapt to your environment or the complexity of your situation, is okay when you've got enough evidence to inform your decision making and to show why you made those choices. So some of the ideas that we put together, in answer to this question, some of the things you've raised already, to be clear about, your policy influence questions. We spoke about this in the very first webinar. We said be clear about what it is that you want to ask, so that you can slot those in or mainstream those into all your different proposals. Having to have internal drivers. Make sure you do monitoring evaluation for yourself, not only for the external organizations, because this will help with building the commitment, and also making sure that that the organizational culture is much more aligned towards gathering, monitoring, evaluation data and using it for adapting and making good decisions. One should make sure that you are able to capture planned and unplanned change. So don't just focus on what you've planned. Also be open to emergent change. This way you'll be able to capture things that change in the environment, or things that you didn't expect. Learning and adaptation is key. I've spoken about that, and making sure that you're flexible and open, and that you have feedback loops, that from the learning you're making sure that that evidence is going back into decision making, and that the decisions that you make about changing your program are then also, you adapt your monitoring evaluation systems accordingly, and that you're not only feeding back internally but also to your external stakeholders, to your donors, your beneficiaries, and so on. It probably makes a lot of sense to select an approach with a few key indicators, which will really tell your story, rather than having a massive set of indicators, because you really want to keep your eye on the things that really matter. And you also don't want to overload your system. If things change, you have to, it's quite a lot of work to change all your tools, and so on. Identify key appropriate tools that will help you to measure change, that will bring in flexibility, and we'll talk a lot about this in the session. as also it's important to be culturally sensitive in the way that you gather your data. If you in a storytelling kind of environmental culture, you don't want to go in with a very strict survey. You want to allow people to tell their stories and so on. And then also design for diversity, so that not in recognizing that not everyone is the same, not every policy maker is the same. Some are more open, some are more closed, some are more in contested fields, some are working in environments which are very conflict heavy, or some are working in countries where they're free to speak, where there's a freedom to share ideas. So you need to design your systems to take account of these kinds of issues. Was that useful to think about it in this way? Is there anything you would add to this list? Yes, that would be very useful. So, in discussion, keeping the discussion going and to discuss these challenges as much as possible and to have collaboration. Collaboration, we should probably add here, collaboration, learning, and adaptation. CLA is what the Americans are now building into the, would have been, I'm not sure if they still will, but USAID talking about collaboration, and I've put it into the module 6, we actually put a bit on this. Collaboration, learning, and adaptation, CLA. Feedback and communication is really important part, and that's also in part of feed loops, making sure that you're communicating and sharing information. Yes, keep your expectations in check, and make sure that if things are outside your control, that you are designing your program and your monitoring evaluation system in such a way to influence them as much as possible, so that you can bring some of it closer to your realm, to a sphere of influence. And to be context specific, sensitive as well, to see how exactly that I was talking about, for example, if you've got a restrictive government or cultural issues around, let's say, women and men talking in the same room, then you won't want to have focus groups with women and men together. You will have separate groups. You will need to make sure that the women are free to speak in an environment where they don't, where the men are not around, for example. Yes, one can have key issues that you evaluate and track, and others that you have as concerns that you will you can keep track of those issues, but not necessarily evaluate them. Good. So the other question that Sylvester had was looking at the project management cycle. Looking at how do you include beneficiaries into your project management, because very often we include beneficiaries either at the design or the evaluation stage, but what are the ways for doing that while we are busy implementing our projects? And how do we make sure that we're checking in with them throughout the implementation phase? Any ideas for this? And particularly with designing indicators as well. My first answer is, while you're writing, is that your indicators should be designed at your design stage. So when you're designing your activities, your outcomes, you design your indicators as well. And so if you have done some kind of a situation analysis and you've spoken to beneficiaries about their needs and you've asked them what's important and what it is they want to see change in their lives, you can use that information to design your indicators. There's no reason why you shouldn't. You can also go back and validate. These are the things we've suggested. How do you think these are important? Yes, Irina, they are usually designed from the top down, but I for example, worked with a think tank which invited policymakers to what they called a research agenda roundtable, where they sat with the policymakers and they shared what it is, the key issues that they were researching the year before, and they said, we are going to now be setting an agenda for the next year. What are the things that you think are important that we need to deal with, and what are the things that you would say, how would you measure our success? And that was, so it is possible to do that, and it also builds relationships with the policymakers. They feel heard. The challenge, of course, is when we went to evaluate a year later, one of the people said, we said they should look at it and they still haven't done it. So that's the challenge if you bring people into the room who are in policymakers, who give of their time and think they're important, and they are, then it's important that you do actually listen to them. So participatory approaches that provide beneficiaries with opportunities for learning and using the M&E process is great. So we'll also talk about some of the participatory methods that we can do that. So for example, you may want to schedule some kind of focus groups or participatory learning kind of workshops with participants, with beneficiaries, so that you can engage with them in key points in the project. You know, like, for example, if the beneficiaries are public or beneficiaries are government departments, then you can include that in your methods. Okay, so some ideas that we had was, you know, I spoke about doing a situation and stakeholder analysis at the beginning, which could also be ongoing, and you could update it over time. You certainly, these kind of process of consultation can be ongoing at key steps. Vanesa's asking if anyone has proven an approach like he's referring to, which was participatory approaches that provide beneficiaries with opportunities for learning and using the M&E processes. So Vesta particularly wants to raise the point that we need to raise the voice of participants, not just see them as not thinking on their behalf. Nick is saying he used a survey last week to collect baseline data, but the results could be used by participants to devise an action plan. Yes, that's great. So it's about feeding back to participants, so they, or to beneficiaries. Once you've got feedback, and use that, people can use that information to empower as a means of empowerment, so that they can actually take control and make plans around that particular situation. Community monitoring system is a really nice way of doing it. You're asking what do I mean under community monitoring system. So for example, let's say you want to change the behavior of a particular government department to be more inclusive for people with disability, maybe a hospital or something. You can actually ask the community around that hospital to keep track of the way that the staff are working with people with disability, or if you want the systems to be more youth-friendly, you can, the UNFPA are busy implementing a project in South Africa at the moment where they're giving the youth cell phone apps where they can then go to the clinic and they can report on the kind of treatment that they received at the clinic. Were they shouted at? Did the nurses give them good advice? Did they get the attention they need, and so on? So systems around services, or even where they are able to give feedback on the services they've received. So I can share some links on community monitoring systems if you like after the webinar, if you're interested. Farmers' own records, for example, is a way, you know, farmers, you can ask them to keep records of their production and how much they're producing and how much they're selling and how much they're trading for, and there's all different ways of doing that. In terms of periodic reviews, you can check in on a periodically every quarter. You can have focus groups with key stakeholder groups. You can have something like called a panel of beneficiaries, which you can do in a survey or in participatory way, where you check in with this, you create a panel and you check in with those same people every 3 months to see how things are moving, changing, what's going on. Roundtable discussions I mentioned already, and after action reviews, where you don't only have to do it internally as the team, where you can actually sit together include the beneficiaries and say, okay, we've finished this action now. What did you think? How did you experience it? What's changed for you? And so on. So that would be all. Of course, all of these things are time consuming. So you would have to pick the most critical ones, and how you would want to engage them. The third question that Sylvester had was what kind of tips for measuring qualitative outcome indicators? Well, this was a really great question that's going to lead into the rest of the webinar, which Vanessa is going to deal with. So thanks for your sharing, and I'm glad you enjoyed the feedback, Sylvester. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you, Dena, for facilitating this very rich discussion, and thank you, Sylvester, for sharing questions with the rest of the group. It was a really good opportunity to reflect together on key challenges that we face. And in fact, as I was reading your answers and contributions, it also made me think about what we're going to address right now, which has to do with approaches and methods. As you might have gone through already in Module 5, we deal into how to select and identify appropriate approaches and methods to gather the evidence you need to gather on indicators that reflect how your outcomes and outputs are and progress as within projects or programs. And this is a very important decision. And when you were just discussing the points about bringing in the voice of beneficiaries, this thing that Nick was raising about using common language free of jargon, I was thinking that within approaches, we should also think about probably about principles. The approaches are the set of options that you use to perform some of all the tasks that are involved in evaluation. It's like the larger framework that guides the way you collect data. And maybe it's not always possible to use a specific approach. Sometimes you might need to have two types of approaches. I'll give some examples of these approaches in a couple of minutes. But it is also important for me to think about the principles and the guidelines and the way you want to answer the evaluation questions. In exercise 2, which was voluntary, some of you who already presented them have been able to identify the big questions. The big questions are very important at the moment of selecting the type of approach you're going to use. That means what is the pathway to collect those data? And it's very important because many times the MEL plans that I review or that I mentor people to develop end up being just a very long list of methods. Methods are the very concrete mechanisms by which you gather data. Many times these methods are a mix of qualitative ones and quantitative ones. So also when we have a tendency to focus or to give more importance to quantitative ones, indeed in the indicators that I usually look at the first, at the preliminary stage of MEL plans, we tend to think about the numbers, right? To kind of demonstrate whether we have had the intended policy, sorry, the intended policy influence or not. Yes, is this okay? So maybe is this my connection? Hello? I hope this was just a glitch. Okay, I'll continue. Hope this gets better. Thank you. So even though we might end up using a mixed approach where we understand that, for instance, if we are trying to assess an output, right? For instance, a very important training that we delivered or an event that took place. Usually we encourage people to think about how many people attended the training or the event. That's important, but we also need to think about the profile and whether the type of persons that participated are the ones that we wanted to bring in. Okay, I'll increase the volume a little bit more. Okay, so the mixed approach, the mixed methods usually work well within policy influence because we don't only want to understand of that influence, but usually it has to do with qualitative aspects such as relevance and access, etc. And what I was telling you is that many times we end up, when we are building these MEL plans and thinking about outcomes and outputs and their related indicators, we try to think about methods that would bring the information on the indicators, and we end up doing very large lists of methods that we intend to apply, right? With surveys and in-depth interviews, lists, all sorts of documentations that we develop within the organizations, and that sometimes makes us kind of forget of the larger picture, of the big questions that we want to answer. What's the story beneath and behind all these indicators and all these lists of outcomes and outputs? And that's when approaches can really help us to have an integrated set of options where we are looking at the evaluation with a larger lens. And I think this point will be more clear when Dena and I share very specific case studies of approaches and why these approaches that contain diverse methods usually are better in terms of linking really well the questions, the evaluation questions that we have about policy influence and the way we gather the data, the very specific and dispersed data that would let us tell the story or not. So let me share let's go briefly through some potential methods and approaches. Both Sylvester's question had to do with outcomes, so let me start with outputs first, and then we'll talk about outcomes. Probably these are the that we are more familiar with when assessing the quality, the relevance, the quantity of our outputs, the usability maybe of those outputs. So probably you are used to seeing many of those methods within your own organizations, or those who are working as consultants with organizations you used to see, right? Probably when thinking about policy influence, when I've seen a lot of reports to donors, and one usual suspect there is to have a media clipping, right? To showcase how many times the organization or the researchers have been quoted, or a piece of research from the organization has been used by journalists to feature a policy problem or to discuss a policy issue. The same happens, a usual suspect has to do with the web statistics. This is, of course, understandable since it's almost free, right? It's a very cheap way, because I say cheap, it's free in terms of the method, the tool. Google Analytics is free, but of course we need to spend some time to collect, look at those statistics, same with downloads or web visits, and analyze what that is telling us. But usually, I mean, there are some regular type of methods that we use to assess our outputs. And sometimes we use, this could be an approach to review against plans. Our plans might have different indicators related to outputs, or even to check whether those outputs that we intended to produce were produced or not, and then the results, right? The effects that those outputs had. And one to organize all these separate methods, media clipping, or the surveys that we could perform in capacity building, or when events take place, or the participants, they could all come together when we are looking at our initial plans and the activities and the products that we were planning to produce and what happened with them. So this could be an approach, like an annual and a more systematic and regular approach, to make sense and to see what the data coming from the methods reveal. Also thinking about the plans, or thinking about our products and activities, the outputs, determining criteria. We saw that in the previous webinar, and we have a lot of information on that on module 4 as well, to think about the criteria, right? What are, and this again has to do with the questions, what do we want to learn out of those outputs? Is it quality we're most concerned about, or is it about the access or the real use of those outputs? So those are the starting points to then think about approaches and methods. So start from your criteria, start from your questions, and from there detect which are the appropriate approaches and methods to answer them. Thinking about shorter outcomes, just as a reminder, we identified, or we describe short-term outcomes as those effects or results of outputs of activities and products on stakeholders, right? And this again might be some of the methods that you are used to seeing, right? The ways to gather feedback from them in terms of understanding the effects or the results that your policy brief had, for instance, in a group of stakeholders or in an event, or maybe have a call after a larger meeting with some of the most relevant attendees to see how they interpreted that meeting, what they took away from it, whether there's any change of attitude or they are aware of something that they were not aware before. So again, these are all usual methods that maybe some of you use. And I would like to stop here and to ask you about taking into account the things that I have just shown. Are all these familiar and easy to use for you? Or do you think that some of them are not that viable, taking into account the resources that your organizations usually have to do Mel? Just a little bit feedback to understand where you stand in terms of deploying this type of methods. Yes, familiar, easy to do. Are these like usual suspects? Citation analysis is a step further from media clipping, and it entails, it could be applied to media clipping in itself, where you are performing an analysis based on different criteria and based on different things that you want to find out in terms of how media, for instance, is quoting and using the information and the evidence that comes from researchers or the organization. So it's not only about saying how many times and what type of featuring, whether it was like a column, an opinion column, or an article, but seeing like with which others is the organization usually quoted with. How is that organization or that research featured? Are there any descriptions about the organization? So it's going a little bit a step further. It could also be about citations by policymakers, right? When they are referring to a policy issue, are they using a word or a concept that the organization is promoting or not? So this means going a little bit further in terms of not only quantifying or describing what you see, but also analyzing how much what you see, the quantity of articles, of quotes from policymaker, really reflect the way you are trying to promote a specific framework, or the way you want to be positioned within a policy community, or how you want your organizations to be featured. I mean, sometimes it's like even the ideology that you are connected with the way that that citation takes place. Yes, I see Nick here is saying that it's a hard task to do. Do you mean because of to keep track when you are thinking about all the other ways that you could be quoted in social media, because of the amount and of information and replies that we might get? Are you aiming at that when you're saying hard? Okay, I was asking Nick about this. Probably that has to do with the overload. Here again, the starting point is the questions and the criteria that are really important. One trap that organizations fall into very frequently is to, just because there's Google Analytics or there's a lot of information about media, we need to track down everything. And I've really worked with some organizations that, after doing a very large effort in collecting digital type of information, they decided that was not really meaningful for them. That wasn't revealing the type of evidence that they want, or helping them understand what they want to understand. So they decided to even stop doing some things. So I think, yes, that sometimes it's not about like you being, because information is there, using all the information, but selecting and deciding whether that is relevant and meaningful for that. Sylvester, I don't understand what you say by what you mean by suggestion box. Maybe if you can clarify. But yes, social media is a whole area to better explore and discover. Especially, I think that we don't have yet enough understanding on how does social media influence policymakers and how policymakers are using the social media, and how much what they say through social media or how they use it really reflects what then they decide in terms of policy. So yes, it's very new and something we need to understand better. So Sylvester is here. Yes, of course that for large movements we cannot, we would never underestimate social media. But I'm thinking more about how a specific field or body of research, or even a research project, can really use social media to have an influence in policymakers and policy. Of course, that using those movements and using discussions that go around social media. I know you didn't want to talk about the USA, but all what is happening right now is a very good opportunity to raise some deep policy issues that are beneath the results of the election. So it's a good opportunity to use social media and link it up to some policy proposals or policy problems that have not been, that people are not aware of. Feedback from participants from suggestion box. Yes, of course, that gathering this direct feedback, I would say here that it's important to think both about the spontaneous feedback, but also as this tool that Sylvester is suggesting is to think about some more systematic ways that for every once in a while to really collect that feedback, and not only waiting for the feedback to come in spontaneously from the people, interested people or participants. Okay, then let's step so that we don't run out of time. There are some also overall, as I was saying, approaches that are like larger and that might include different methods that we've just explored, that have to do with that are specific approaches that are usually useful for tracking ones. So I won't be going through all of them by detail. I think that many of you are maybe knowledgeable or have heard, and you have all this information in the modules. We think it's better to really discuss how they play out in very concrete stories of organizations that are using them. But so, oh, sorry, what happened? Hold a second. For some reason, it went on. Okay. Hold a second. I'm sorry about that. I cannot recall which was the. Okay, here, yes, of course. So these are all approaches that are frequently used to do some policy influence monitoring and evaluation. Some are more evaluative type of approaches, where the type of evidence is gathered after the policy influence effort. This might be familiar to you, the stories of change or the episode stories when you go back, right? You have the story, you have the results, and then you go back to the story and reconstruct what happened to get there. I see that question is from Nick. My question would be that policy. Oh, okay, Nick, I didn't get that. Yes, of course, that social media really is quite of a challenge there to say. I think it's more linked to raising awareness about a policy issue, to place a topic in the agenda, but the real understanding on the way forward, or to really articulate policy alternatives, social media is not the best way, right, to go forward. Yes. Yes, Ricardo from Canada. No, he's not from Canada. It's not. Sorry, it's Ricardo Grau Wilson. He's the creator of outcome harvesting, and we'll learn a little bit more about this approach with Dena, who's going to tell us a story about that. Ricardo Wilson is the creator of outcome harvesting, and there are some links where you can, in 3 minutes, learn about it. But is there, I'd like to learn before, to know from you, have you tried out any of these approaches in terms of policy influence? Let me go back to the first one. The outcome mapping is something that maybe you've heard of. Then we have the bellwether method, most significant change, contribution analysis. Does any one of you have experience in applying an integrated approach to evaluate or to monitor and evaluate a policy influence project or process? Or is it all quite new to you? Oh, yeah, okay, great. That would be great. I was asking that because it might be something that before in the course we could do to kind of tap into those who have already tried some of them. So process tracing and stories of change. Do you have already a public report or something that you could share in terms of process tracing? I think the stories of change we've seen quite a lot of them coming through. It's like the usual and initial approach that was used to feature policy influence took place, but I haven't seen an example of process tracing. So that would be interesting to see. So you used, yes, probably what you're doing is a mix of methods, right? Of qualitative and quantitative methods. And I'm asking this just because we'll get into the two examples, and one of them is using a very structured type of approach, while the other organization has created its own approach. I'm asking this because many times what ends up happening is that we stay at the methods level, because many of these approaches really entail a lot of time and resources and to become really knowledgeable about how to do them. For instance, outcome mapping. I'm sure many of you are aware of the outcome mapping community. They have lots of resources, and there's a lot of real life and concrete experiences of doing outcome mapping, which is centered specifically on outcomes and what happens at the level of the stakeholders as a middle ground level where you can analyze how those outcomes then led to larger type of influence in policy. So I'm making the point that many times these approaches are really complex and sophisticated, and they entail a lot of resources. So many times we end up doing just a little one of them, or to just deploy a mix of methods to tell our stories and to evaluate policy influence. But another way is to use these approaches and tailor-make, develop your tailor-made approaches. So use them as a way to inspire the way forward, and to have to try to gather a way or to detect a way in which you plan to look at policy influence and to reply or to respond to your policy influence very general questions. And that way forward, looking at some of these approaches might then be a nice way to identify then whether those methods that you're usually using or the ones you were planning to use are really appropriate, or that you need to do some other things. Yes, Sylvester, I'll briefly, because we need to move on, I'll briefly talk about the bellwether method. I just told you the basis of outcome mappings has to do with looking at these intermediate type of outcomes, it's the usual black box of results, right? Where we're trying to track what happened to get into or to be able to achieve or not longer term objectives that have to do with social change. So yeah, outcome mapping implies identifying individuals or groups or organizations that you're trying to influence, and then to plan and monitor whether change among those took place or not, whether the strategies that you had identified to promote those type of changes, which can be outcome mapping usually talks about behavioral changes, but it can be changes in attitudes and beliefs, right? You track those changes at the level of the stakeholders, and you monitor what has happened to see then whether those intermediate type of changes led or not to the more long-term changes that one wants to see. And the bellwether method is a very interesting one. The bellwether method is a method where it's specifically well fit to efforts that have to do with positioning a specific issue in the policy agenda, and to track whether your organization or the group is being effective in terms of establishing a specific issue or framing a specific issue in a concrete way. And this is using bellwethers. Bellwethers are influential people who are really, they can come from public or the private sectors, and they have positions that really require them to be very politically informed, and that they are systematically tracking a broad range of policy issues. So they are policy savvy, right? They are knowledgeable about, they are usually thought leaders, and their opinions usually bear weight on policy influences. And they also, their opinions can have a sort of predictive value in terms of what can happen with the policy. So the methodology implies going and asking those bellwethers about some policy issues without being that specific at the beginning, in terms of not asking them whether the organization or a piece of research has got their attention or not, but how they are understanding the issue or the policy. What do they think are the upcoming policy challenges and issues that are going to be discussed? Which ones they feel that some action will be taken up on, and what sorts of alternatives they see more viable in the future in terms of decisions that could be made. So it's a way to assess, it's a thermometer, right, of the policy agenda, and also a little bit into the implementation in terms of gauging their own perspectives in terms of what might become the most probable policy scenarios. So that's the bellwether method. Yes, and it's usually, I mean, it's not only used by media, it can be used by any policy influence organization, a think tank, but also a CSO. But of course, it has to do with the salience of that issue in the policy agenda. So going back to our first webinar, where we were discussing about what policy influence is. If policy influence right now for your organization has to do with establishing an issue in the agenda, or framing or reframing the way an issue is discussed or understood within the policy agenda, this might be a good method to think about. Okay, so that being said, let us go into very concrete stories. How do organizations use these methods and approaches to get better at evaluating their policy influence? And again, this is just to inspire you and to think about how others have done it, and start to think about your own way. Start to feel what might be a good approach and which would be the most adequate methods for your own efforts. Yes, Nick, of course that the media is the most specific example. Thanks for the clarification. So Dena, if you want to come in and share the first story, and then I'll follow up with another one.
Okay, so hi. You watch these videos, we will share the links with you on the platform, and then you can get some more information about these methodologies. But I'll give you a very brief overview now of outcome harvesting, which is a methodology that fits very well with outcome mapping. So outcome mapping is a planning tool, and we do explain it in one of the modules. I think, I'm not sure, it's module 4 or 5. And the links are to those web videos are in module 5 as well, as Vanessa is saying. So we applied the idea of outcome harvesting to a think tank here in South Africa, and they have a project called Global Economic Governance Africa, GEG Africa, which has attempted to, I'll show you now what it tried to do. It attempted to bring about changes in policy, various stakeholders such as the media, South African policymakers, other African think tanks, African universities and institutions to think differently about how to participate in the global economic governance agenda, for example, the G20, the World Trade Organization, and various other global economic governance like World Economic Forum and so on, to start thinking about how Africa organizations can have more of a stronger voice in these forums and organizations. One of the things that so let's look at, we spoke in the earlier sessions about the kinds of changes and policy influence strategies that organizations will adopt, and so I've used this framework to explain what they were doing. So they were basically doing quality research, they were doing capacity building, they were organizing events, and they were ensuring strategic communication and dissemination of their research, as well as building cross relationships across the continent with other think tanks and getting them to do research and host events and snowballing basically the methodology across the continent. So those were their strategies for influencing policy. We're working very strongly with the South African government as a kind of a boundary partner, and then working with the think tanks and other African think tanks to reach their policymakers in other African countries. So they became boundary partners. Boundary partners is one of the key ideas in outcome mapping, which says you don't always work directly with your final beneficiaries, but you work through partners to reach those beneficiaries. And those partners are in your sphere of interest, of influence, whereas the beneficiaries are not necessarily. So with those boundary partners, what are the kinds of changes that they were wanting to bring about? Like they went, let's use, for example, the media. They were doing lots of media training. They wanted the media to change their attitudes towards global economic governance, to find it something that's interesting to report on, that they would have the capacity to report on these issues, that they would know how to understand what's coming out of G20 meetings, and how to prepare populations and policymakers to think about the important issues, how to frame the discourse around global economic governance, to get them to actually then write articles and to talk, to have experts that the local TV shows could phone, to the bellwethers, for example, could talk about these important issues. So I wanted them to also have relationships with think tanks to write about global economic governance. So that was an example of the kinds of changes they wanted to bring about just with the media, and we thought about those kinds of changes that they would bring about with all their different stakeholders. Then I'm not sure how to move the slide to the left. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So then we can talk about these intermediate changes. Yeah, these intermediate outcomes where we spoke about and understanding the policy agenda, the policy process. We spoke about that in the early webinars and in the early modules, where we said the kind of changes that you could hope to achieve through these immediate change in actors are setting the policy agenda, getting policymakers to be interested in global. For example, the Nigerian partners were saying our policymakers aren't interested in global economic governance. They're so busy focusing on domestic issues. Well, that was one of the things, for example, that they wanted to shift by raising the issue in the media and by getting more research on global economic governance, getting the policymakers to think about how global institutions affect domestic policy, how what's happening on the global stage affects poverty or inequality at home. So other ways to think about immediate outcomes: changing policy procedures, introducing changes to policy delivery, and more research-friendly policy environment. So this was the framework for thinking about the project. Then we decided to use outcome harvesting as a way of evaluating this project after 3 years of being implementation. And what outcome harvesting does, it doesn't only focus necessarily on what you plan to change, but it says what did the project create, what changes have come about that we can then dig back into the project and tell the story about how that change came about. So the process is you design some questions around the harvest. You then gather and draft outcome descriptions. What are the descriptions that of change around those questions? So the questions would be, for example, what were the key outcomes that we achieved with the media around their interaction with global economic governance? And we sat with so in order to get some outcome descriptions, we actually read project documents, and then we sat with the team and we asked them what did they think the most important outcomes were that they had achieved through their work with the media. Once we had, or through their work with think tanks in the area. And then we got those outcomes, we asked them to describe those outcomes, and we added to that with the document review. So we got quite good detailed of what changed, when did it change, how did it change, who was important in making that change, and so on. So that's really in formulating these outcome descriptions, a bit of back and forth on that, making sure we had a good story. The next step is then really to substantiate, to go to others that were not involved in that, creating that story, to see did that change actually come about? Do you think that this is accurate? And also to ask them maybe who else was involved. These substantiators could be people like your bellwethers, for example, experts in the field who know what's going on and can tell us whether things have changed or not. You then analyze, interpret the data that you get, and then you write your report and then share that with your stakeholders and so on, whatever process you use, and then support the use of the findings. So it comes back very much into the use. So just to go back to how this is related to outcome mapping, in outcome mapping you talk about the project, which is your sphere of control. You can control the things that happen in your project. You have your sphere of influence, which is where you're working together with your boundary partners. And then you have the beneficiaries that will benefit from that, which is what outcome mapping calls about your sphere of concern. You can't influence it directly because your boundary partners do that, but you are concerned about what's happening in that group. So with the outcomes harvest, what you're doing is you're calling the people in your project are called the change agents. The people who are in your sphere of influence are the social actors, let's say the government departments that you're working through, or the think tanks, or the media. They become your social, the media, the journalists who come on your training, for example. They are the social actors. And then your sphere of concern, they could be your substantiators, your bellwethers. They're people who are concerned about not only beneficiaries, but who are concerned about what it is that you do, but not directly involved. So what we discovered through this methodology, through using this outcome harvesting, is we discussed with them ways to measure these outcomes at the different levels. So we sat with the team and we said, what were the kind of outcomes that you had in your sphere of control? And here we developed, they said, for example, through this project they had managed to improve their monitoring evaluation systems, and they'd also improved their strategy. They'd decided to use a policy windows approach for planning their projects. So that was what we could, the two key outcomes that they had got as part of their internal sphere of control. Then, in terms of their, with their boundary partners, for example, some of the outcomes they shared were that journalists were writing more about, this is a tax example, about tax in a more sophisticated way. Or think tanks in Africa had adopted a tax research agenda where they may not have been researching about tax before. They had started to do some research into tax regimes and so on. They found that in some examples, government had actually started introducing a new tax collection regime as a result of the research, some of the research that they had shared with that government department, and that's a very concrete behavioral change there from government. Also, more diverse people had started to attend their events, which was a good thing because before they had only been attracting students, but now through this methodology they had started attracting government officials, academics, and other think tanks and a wider range of people. And then in the sphere of influence, some of the issues that they had noticed changing was that there was a growing international tax justice network, which they had been a key part of establishing, which had now developed a life of its own and had own funding and so on. And there was a greater focus in the G20 on tax. Now, obviously, it wasn't just this organization that had contributed to that, but certainly getting more African organizations to be interested in this will then eventually, hopefully, to have some links to that. Okay, so so I've got 2 minutes left. Vanesa's just telling me, so I'm going to move forward. So just looking at the example here of the government introduces the new tax collection regime, who did we actually speak to? How did we find out? How did we substantiate that story? Well, firstly, we spoke to the organization and we developed their description of change. That was the first thing we did. We then spoke to the social actors that were involved in the story, the policymakers and the other influencers, and we asked them, how did that organization. We did in-depth interviews, and we also did document review, spoke to those policymakers about their role in this and the role of the think tank. And then we went to speak to substantiators, policy analysts, officials from ministries, other think tanks, and even other international players like the World Bank and the that were active in that, or the other governments like DFID office and so on, who were interested in tax to find out did it actually happen as the way the organization says, and what was their contribution. So that was the way that we used this particular method to develop the story, but then also to validate that story and use the outcome harvesting approach. And then you go back to the stakeholders, you discuss that with them one more time, and validate, before you finalize your report. Sorry, Nick had a question. Does the difference in perception between the implements and the bellwethers influence the conclusion of the evaluation? Yes. So, but when you go back to the final validation process, you will discuss with your stakeholders again. You can bring them in together into the same room, but I find with sensitive policy issues that becomes very difficult. You have to then have a process of discussion and negotiation with the think tank to see where to find the common ground, or to get your final conclusions. The contribution tracing adds a dimension to this where they actually weigh the evidence. That's another method that they use to actually take that one step further, but the outcome harvesting does it through consultation. Does that answer your question, Nick? Great. So any other questions before we move on to Vanesa about this particular method? I have shared a guide with you in the module 5. There's a very nice guide that you can look at, which explains exactly step by step how you do it. It gives you sample questionnaires. It's by Ricardo Wilson Ground. It's done for the Ford Foundation. And if you're interested, you can go and have a look and watch the video. Thank you. Vanesa.
Excellent, Dena. Yeah, excellent. Very clear story, and I like how many of the things that we've been discussing around play. I'd like to briefly share, we don't have a lot of time, we're running a little bit late, but just to get a flavor of another way of working around how to monitor and evaluate policy influence. And this is the case of a think tank that is based in Chile, but it works with chapters and partners in different countries of Latin America on rural development. This might be a good example to address some of the questions that we discussed at the beginning of the webinar and that Sylvester raised, right? Because the fact that they are sometimes part of our projects are implemented by partners, and these partners are maybe other think tanks or experts in other countries, and sometimes it's their own chapters. So the degree of commitment and the type of relationship of people doing MEL in the different countries was diverse. So they needed, what they knew is that what they were doing at the point where we started working with them to develop a way to monitor and evaluate policy influence is that they were gathering stories of change. They had some isolated data depending on what went well in some of the countries, just to report on those achievements. But they needed to really be able to do this type of monitoring and evaluation. To do monitoring, because they were almost not doing monitoring, but just like, collating data without a specific process, just to make sure that at the evaluation point they could show something. They wanted to do this in a more systematic way, so to monitor the way policy influence was taking place or not, and also to be more rigorous. So it was, it's not that they weren't doing anything at all, they wanted to take the evaluation to an upper level and to really understand the outcomes of their efforts. Many of their stories and a lot of their data had to do with whether they, at that point, whether they had been able to achieve a change in a policy process or in a policy content. And they were not at all looking at the middle ground changes, at the outcomes and what was happening with the stakeholders. The sole exception was whether they were bringing in relevant profiles to rural development discussion groups that they were creating. So just to assess whether those groups were working well, they did kind of get some feedback in terms of the stakeholders that were participating and their perceived value of participating in these groups. So we started with two premises when this was a very participatory approach that we took in terms of defining which would be the best way forward. The IDS methodology, even though I was working with them as a consultant, was that this methodology was going to be used by them for most of the projects, the ones that had enough scale, of course. So we had to agree on the logic, right, and the rationale and how to do it. And the first agreement had to do that with the fact that the outcomes that I was mentioning earlier on are really a very important part of the causal change, right? The causal change between their products and activities, the stakeholders, and the more longer term type of effects. And that the fact also that within this causal change and the different type of effects that they could have within isolated stakeholders, group of stakeholders, organizations, policy processes, etc., there were different degrees of attribution and contribution. So different parts of the change would have different ways of release coming in. But basically, the effects were going to be tracked in three main areas. What happened at the level of the stakeholders, what happened at the level of the policies, and what happened at the level of the processes. And I'll share I'm getting ahead of time. I'll share the lessons from her about how this structure played out in the different countries. So for that, to really be able to do that path and to really be able to gather information about the outcomes among stakeholders, but also changes in policy, processes, and content, we agreed to follow 6 major steps. And to start mainly with the problem tree. A problem tree was a way to really determine within the large rural development issues which were the ones that were causes, which one were consequences, which were the real main problems that they were trying to address. And in terms of that, think about the stakeholders that were more related to the main problems. So the problem tree is a good way to focus, because many times when you have large organizations or large programs, everyone is trying to do everything at the same time and trying to tap into all the problems at the same time. But as you develop the problem tree, it's a good way to really lead into determining much more concrete policy objectives and to identify what specifically within all these problems and with the viable strategies an organization can contribute with, where their competitive advantages are. And once, this problem tree and the stakeholders were mapped, and they had a better idea and a more explicit idea on focus and where to focus the efforts. We cannot communicate with everybody. They were doing a lot of communications things, but those communications usually weren't that targeted. So when one sees the stakeholders map and one can identify which ones are the most crucial in terms of the contribution that the organization wants to make to the policy, they defined the type of a sort or a preliminary list of some of those intermediate results, some changes that were really key. In some cases, they were more about raising awareness. In others, were more about developing capacities, depending on the stage of the policy and the country and the context. So this was very context sensitive because the type of results could be very different. I mean, in the different countries, right? And then, of course, make some assumptions on how those intermediate results could lead to the intermediate results at the level of the policies and processes. And let me say that here they were not saying specifically, they were not mentioning one specific policy, but most of the expected results had to do with change at least one rural development policy that affects women, for instance. So that opened up the space to different policies to come in, or different ways of working around that. And then, of course, they were very interested, and this was also due to the donors' questions, to really try to say whether the policies that they were going to promote had an impact, and how much real evidence and how much research they had on that intended impact. And once was that, of course, they came up with that evidence that they needed to gather, to track evidence on all these levels, which type of evidence would really be solid and rigorous to say, if we promote this type of policies, this is what going to happen, and what evidence they would recollect on the policy and processes and themselves, and with stakeholders as well. So the stages that this methodology follows had to do with first designing that desired impact. That's what we've just done. Then take some time to track both desired and not undesired, right, and expected changes. So besides looking into the list of their intended outcomes and the changes, they also systematically documented any other story that was unexpected, or any turn of opportunity. For instance, a minister that they didn't expect that would get interested. Of course, they tracked that interest, and they started to generate some documentation on what was happening with that ministry after that expression of interest. So after tracking that, this is the monitoring with diverse levels of sophistication and regularity in the different countries. The evaluation stage was set up where they came up and discussed with leaders of each country to see what changes they came up with, and how meaningful and how important those changes were for the whole organization and its initial intentions and goals, right? And finally, and this is where they could not get that far, there was a stage that had to do with knowledge management, to be able to systematize what emerged as lessons learned and conclusions in the evaluation, to make sure that whatever they learned could then feed into the different countries. This has been done not that systematically yet, but at least what they decided to go ahead was with learning notes. And these learning notes are more synthetic versions of the whole evaluation, where different stakeholders can access to why they did what they did and what the results were. So those learning notes were not there before developing this methodology. So just to wrap up, what did they learn? I mean, this was, I'm telling you about the story of the design and how we set it up. And then they had one small pilot. We refined the methodology based on that pilot, and then they realized that it was a viable methodology and that they could use it throughout the whole program. we did the final evaluation of that program using a lot of data and evidence that was gathered using this methodology. So of course that took the evaluation to another level, because they had been able to already gather and analyze their outcomes and results in a more systematic way and in a more agreed way. But there were some problems, of course, too. One was that this project was not theory-based in terms of they couldn't set up, since they were working through these rural development groups, these groups had the flexibility to determine which type of policy influence they wanted to have. So at the beginning, they needed to remain open and flexible. So the ex-ante approach to really determine those outcomes from the beginning was not that easy to, those results, sorry, at the beginning was not that easy. But what they could discuss with these groups was more related to the outcomes. What are the changes we need to see in the different stakeholders with which we'll interact? Are we really pushing to to make changes in knowledge of certain groups, etc.? So yes, Nick, what do you mean by theory after the exercise? Okay, yes, I'm about to wrap up. If you can clarify that, Nick, I'll answer. They realized that the methodology, if it's applied in a participatory way, that means working with the offices in other countries to gather their own sense of what can be achieved and how the layout, the initial design is going to reflect better the reality of what is going to happen next. And this also applies to building a tree problem. If you bring more people and more perspectives in, then you're going to be looking at the problem, reflecting complexity, and being able to discuss and agree on the focus in a more interactive manner, and to really have that clarity from early on. Then also in terms of implementation, some of the categories, for instance, like whether those changing stakeholders could be really strongly linked to results at the level of policy content or process, that it was not always easy, right, to make the claim. So that's there was room for improvement in terms of assessing and gauging how certain changes at the level of stakeholders could explain or contribute greatly to a policy process or content. And finally, I already talked about this theory-based approach when you're being more of a circular, and how to think about larger type of outcomes where you're not working with such a tight and strict framework. We can say that after several reports and piloting, really the final reports were produced in a much more efficient way, having a common way to go through MEL, to address MEL, and to start figuring out what needed to be gathered and why and how. That took the evaluation at another level, and the type of questions that they were able to answer in the final evaluation, which were much more rich and complex, and they were not just like a laundry list of achievements, but really in-depth analysis of whether those contributions were the most strategic for different countries, more relevant from the policy makers' perspectives, whether those implied a change in the identity of the organization and the way forward, the way they organize themselves. So basically, it was a good coming up with this methodology on their own and trying it out and looking for a way that could be worked in the different settings was a really, really very important step forward in terms of taking the evaluation to a level where they really learn, and can make strategic decisions based on the evidence that emerged. Thank you for the time and the patience. I know I ran a little bit later. I don't know if I think that Nick had a question about maybe he had to leave. So any questions? Otherwise, I'll just go into the next steps. There's a blog post from Renis about that, or if anyone wants to learn a little bit about their experience, we can facilitate that knowledge too. So our next steps are to deliver the exercise 2. Some of you already told us that you wanted to use the deadline. The deadline is tomorrow, because next week we need to concentrate efforts on exercise 3. Exercise 3 is the mandatory, so exercise 2 was voluntary, is due next week. You have the instructions in module 6, but basically we would love to see that after taking this course, you're able to draft a MEL plan where you can really be able to decide a level into which apply the MEL lens and identify some important evaluation, policy influence objectives, and as well as questions, big questions that you could have. It can be at the level of a project with a client, a project of a client, it can be a program, it can be within the whole organization. Some of you are even choosing to monitor and evaluate the way the organization is learning. That's another, the learning about policy influence is another strategic choice you can make. And based on that, think about these potential outcomes and related indicators, and hopefully also the methods, the most appropriate methods of approaches that you could foresee that could be implemented to answer those questions and to assess the progress towards the objectives. So if you have any specific questions or you need some help when going through exercise 3, which is quite, that's what intensive, and it will probably take time in terms of thinking and linking well the different levels of the plan, please drop us a line and preferably ask the questions through the forum, because all your peers will be working in the same direction, and I'm sure that they will benefit from any clarifications or guidance that we can make. And then we will send this week a link with the SurveyMonkey survey, so that you can evaluate us and we can also gather your feedback and some evidence on what has worked well and what we need to improve next time. So please do take 5-10 minutes to respond to us and let us know about what worked well. So let me see if there are any. Being said, I'll sorry about the 10-minute delay. We started a little bit later too, but hope it has been, the additional minutes have been worth it. No, Sylvester, the evaluation, we are not evaluating you. We don't have quizzes here at to get the certificate. The evaluation, the way we evaluate you is through the exercises, whether you are able to produce and apply the shared knowledge through the exercises. For us, that's the best tool to evaluate your own participation. So those who want a certificate and want to get evaluated, turn the exercise in, receive our feedback, and if you want, also review the exercises. That's the best way to apply knowledge for us. So thank you for today. A lot of food on the table, but hopefully you leave out happy. Oh, yes, I was going to answer. Nick is asking for some help in terms of RBA literature or experience. I personally, I was about to reply that I haven't worked with that, but yes, please others, if it would be very helpful if you could have come across information, knowledge, or experiences that can help Nick sort it out. Thanks again. I'll switch my mic off and we can continue through the chat.